Hidden in the Appalachian hills of West Virginia, far from bustling highways and the glare of modern life, lives a family that has come to symbolize one of the most taboo subjects in American history: generational inbreeding. The Whittakers, known for their silence, physical abnormalities, and tightly woven lineage, are not characters of folklore or exaggerated rumor. They are real people, living reminders of what happens when extreme isolation and repeated familial unions collide. Their story is not simply one of curiosity, but of deep tragedy, societal neglect, and a haunting legacy that echoes across decades. The origins of the Whittaker family began, as most Appalachian tales do, with migration and settlement. In the mid-19th century, America's expanding industrial age had yet to touch many parts of rural Appalachia. Families seeking escape from economic hardship or judgment found refuge in the dense forests and valleys of West Virginia. Among them were the early Whittaker ancestors, people of English and Scots-Irish descent, who built simple lives in the hills, farming, hunting, and living without much need for outside contact. For them, marrying within the community, or even within the extended family, was less an aberration than a necessity. Over time, as roads remained unpaved and schools and institutions remained scarce, the Whittakers grew more insular. They lived in homes without plumbing, electricity, or formal education. Generations came and went, and so did the critical safeguards against genetic degradation. Marriages among cousins became common, and in time, those cousins were the children of cousins themselves. It was not out of malice or perversity, but out of isolation, both geographical and social. The world around them changed rapidly, but the Whittakers remained suspended in time, living as their great-grandparents once had. The first public glimpse into the family came in the early 2000s, when locals in the area cautiously told stories of that family up in the holler. Whispers of deformities, odd behaviors, and nonverbal communication circulated among neighboring towns. For years, they were largely ignored by officials, dismissed as just another backwoods family. But beneath that veneer of apathy lay a much darker truth, a lineage so tightly intertwined that the effects of inbreeding were not just visible, they were devastating. The most famous members of the family, such as Timmy Whittaker, brought sudden national attention when photographer and filmmaker Mark Leda documented the family's lifestyle. What viewers saw was both shocking and deeply sad. Timmy, who is nonverbal, communicates only through grunts. Other family members exhibit varying degrees of cognitive impairment. Their home, a weather-worn structure with boarded windows and broken furniture, sits like a monument to neglect. And yet, despite their circumstances, the Whittakers appeared oddly content, laughing together, welcoming guests with shy smiles, and fiercely protecting one another from ridicule. The Whittakers' genetic story is extreme, but not unique in the context of isolated Appalachian communities. Scientists who have studied such populations often point to founder effects, where small groups of people with limited genetic diversity reproduce over time, leading to an increased expression of recessive traits. In the Whittakers' case, these traits manifest in ways that are medically significant: facial deformities, mental retardation, speech limitations, and physical disabilities. These are not the product of a single union, but of generations of consanguinity, uncle-niece marriages, first-cousin pairings, and even more complex genetic entanglements. What makes the Whittaker story particularly disturbing is how long it went unacknowledged. There were no interventions, no state inquiries, no medical outreach until outsiders arrived with cameras. The moral question becomes inescapable. How could a family so visibly impacted be left to deteriorate unnoticed in one of the most developed nations on Earth? Is this simply a byproduct of rural poverty, or a willful turning away by a society that prefers not to look too closely at its own neglected shadows? To understand the Whittakers, one must also understand the systemic forces that contributed to their isolation. West Virginia's coal towns collapsed in the late 20th century, leaving thousands unemployed and entire communities cut off from economic opportunity. Schools shut down, healthcare was nearly non-existent, and addiction ran rampant. In places like Boone County and Raleigh County, survival became the only priority, and survival meant staying close to family, however small the gene pool became. The Whittakers are not alone in their legacy. Across the U.S., particularly in the Appalachian and Ozark regions, there are other families whose genetic stories echo theirs. But few have captured the public imagination in the same way. Perhaps it's because their appearance defies our understanding of modern America. Perhaps it's because their lives seem both ancient and contemporary, a living contradiction. Or perhaps it's because they serve as a mirror, a harsh reflection of what society allows when poverty, geography, and stigma collide. Some have tried to paint the Whittakers as grotesque oddities, using them for viral content or shock value. This, too, is a tragedy. Their lives are not carnival attractions. They are human beings, shaped by forces beyond their control. They are victims of an invisible epidemic, genetic entrapment born of isolation, compounded by generations of neglect. And yet, within the grim portrait lies a spark of something more complicated. The family, though genetically compromised, demonstrates resilience. They care for one another, find joy in small moments, and maintain a sense of loyalty few outside their circle can understand. In this way, the Whittakers challenge the viewer to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about biology and genetics, but about humanity, dignity, and responsibility. Up next, we will explore the scientific underpinnings of inbreeding, how it affects cognitive development, physical health, and longevity, using the Whittakers as a case study. We'll also look into how the American legal system, public health networks, and cultural taboos have contributed to the silence around families like theirs. Because the question isn't just how this happened, but why we let it continue for so long. To understand the haunting tragedy of the Whittakers is to move beyond the surface, to peer through the fog of judgment, viral fascination, and cultural myth, and explore the complex web of biology, history, and institutional failure that allowed such a lineage to persist unchallenged for generations. The story does not rest solely in the hills of West Virginia, but in the DNA strands twisted tightly over time, in the quiet failures of school systems, and in the chilling silence of public health agencies. Inbreeding, in its most clinical definition, is the reproduction between individuals who are closely related by blood. The closer the relation, the higher the chance that dangerous recessive genes, normally hidden in a broader genetic pool, will match and manifest. When siblings or first cousins procreate, the likelihood of both passing on the same mutated gene increases dramatically, resulting in children more susceptible to physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, and other hereditary illnesses. In the Whittaker family, these effects appear visibly and profoundly. Nonverbal communication, facial asymmetry, developmental delay, traits which accumulate generation after generation due to the narrow gene pool, a phenomenon known in genetic science as inbreeding depression. Over time, the risk of congenital disorders compounds with each repeated familial union, and any rare harmful mutation within the lineage has nowhere to go but inward. While genetics lay the groundwork for these complications, the environment in which they manifest cannot be ignored. The Whittakers have lived for generations in rural Appalachia, an area marked by both geographical and institutional isolation. The hollers and ridges of this region often block not just highways, but access to healthcare, education, and governmental oversight. It's not merely physical distance, but bureaucratic neglect that has kept families like the Whittakers hidden for so long. There are areas where no pediatrician ever visits, where schools don't have the resources to identify cognitive delays, where mental health is a whispered rumor rather than an accessible service. Children born into these places can spend lifetimes unrecognized by formal systems, never diagnosed, never treated, never even named in a file. What emerges is not simply a family suffering from a biological consequence of inbreeding, but a portrait of systemic abandonment. The Whittakers, and others like them, become ghosts within the American landscape, existing in the margins where poverty meets medical neglect and stigma ensures continued silence. These families are often reluctant to engage with outsiders. This isn't simple paranoia, but inherited caution, built from generations of being judged, mocked, or treated as spectacles rather than people. Outsiders have historically not brought help, but exploitation. That fear of scrutiny turns to self-isolation. And with no intervention, no diagnosis, no therapy, no family planning education, the cycle repeats, a genetic trap closing tighter with each generation. For years, no one knew the Whittakers outside their county. That changed when photographer Mark Leda traveled into their world and recorded interviews. The resulting images and videos, which captured adult men grunting rather than speaking, and homes in decay, shocked viewers across the globe. But while some viewers responded with compassion, others fell into voyeurism, treating the footage like freak show content rather than an urgent case study in what happens when systems fail utterly. These were not staged images. This was a real family, suffering in real time, in a forgotten part of the richest country on earth. Leda's work shined a spotlight, but the deeper question remains. Why did it take so long for anyone to notice? Where were the social services, the public health campaigns, the schools? The truth is uncomfortable. In rural America, many families are never truly seen by the state. Sociologists describe this phenomenon as rural invisibility. These are people who fill out census forms inconsistently, who live outside mapped infrastructure, who exist in places where the postal service barely functions, let alone specialized healthcare. And because the Whittakers are white and rural, they do not fit neatly into many of the narratives around poverty or oppression that dominate national discourse. Their suffering is not only hidden, it is ignored. And in that vacuum, inbreeding doesn't just happen by accident. It becomes an inevitability. Compounding this invisibility is the enormous social taboo surrounding incest. In American culture, few subjects are as universally reviled. That revulsion ensures silence. Families dealing with inbreeding-related disabilities are often too ashamed to seek help. Even when help is available, stigma chokes off access. The shame becomes generational, passed down not just in whispered conversations, but in avoided doctor visits, in refused interviews, in complete detachment from anything resembling public life. The stigma becomes a secondary prison, locking these families in isolation even when escape is theoretically possible. Legal systems haven't always helped either. While all 50 states ban marriage between siblings, many allow cousin marriage. In regions like Appalachia, cousin unions are not uncommon, particularly when isolated populations lack access to outsiders. This is not due to moral failing, but logistics. When entire communities are separated from the rest of the state by poor roads, failing economies, and deep cultural suspicion, the available pool of partners becomes narrow, sometimes dangerously so. And without access to genetic counseling or sex education, even well-meaning individuals may find themselves perpetuating cycles they do not fully understand. Meanwhile, local governments, overwhelmed by budget cuts and understaffed agencies, often turn a blind eye. There are counties in West Virginia with one or two social workers responsible for hundreds of children. There are school systems where special education is run by teachers without proper credentials. Even when someone flags a concern, the machinery required to investigate and intervene is often broken or rusted from disuse. That is not merely inefficiency, it is abdication. And yet, there is still a haunting moral question to confront. Is shining a spotlight on families like the Whittakers doing more harm than good? When documentarians enter these spaces, are they bringing help or simply framing suffering for content? Mark Lada's videos brought global attention, but also drew accusations of exploitation. The Whittakers received food, some donations, and awareness, but they also received mockery. The ethical tightrope between visibility and dignity remains fragile, and there is no easy answer. What is clear, though, is that without that visibility, nothing would change. The first step to breaking the cycle is seeing the cycle and seeing those trapped inside of it not as oddities, but as victims of failed systems. Ultimately, the Whittaker family story is more than a backwoods curiosity. It is a cautionary tale. A society that allows such suffering to persist in silence must re-examine its structures. Public health must reach into every
Subscribe to
corner,
my channel.
including the forgotten ones. Rural school systems need more than textbooks. They need eyes that see, hands that help, and hearts that understand. And above all, the cultural conversation around inbreeding must mature. It must evolve from disgust to inquiry, from mockery to support. Because behind every inbred child is not a single moment of wrongdoing, but a long chain of failures, genetic, social, and governmental, that must be acknowledged and broken.